The air in the maintenance bay was a physical weight. It tasted of ozone, hot metal, and the bitter tang of hydraulic fluid baking under the relentless glare of a Kandahari sun that hammered the corrugated steel roof. Heat radiated in shimmering waves from the hulls of the hulking armored vehicles, turning the vast, cavernous space into a convection oven. For the dozen young Marines huddled in the sliver of shade offered by a disabled light armored vehicle, the air was not just hot. It was heavy with the presence of Gunnery Sergeant Thorne. He was the center of gravity in this world of steel and sweat, a planet in his own right, and these young men were merely satellites caught in his orbit, their futures dictated by his gravitational pull. Thorne was a man carved from granite and indignation. His barrel chest strained the fabric of his desert camouflage utilities, and his voice was not merely a sound, but a geological event, a rockslide of gravel and command that echoed off the high ceiling. He paced before his audience, a predator in his natural habitat, his boots crunching on the grimy concrete floor. He was performing, as he always was. Authority, in his mind, was not a state of being, but a constant, aggressive broadcast. It had to be seen, heard, and felt every waking moment, or it might simply cease to exist. His worldview was a simple, brutalist architecture. There were hammers and there were nails. He was a hammer. His purpose was to strike, to shape, to indent the world with his will. Everyone and everything else was a nail, waiting for the blow that would give it purpose. "You maggots think you know pressure?" he boomed, his voice scraping the air raw. He jabbed a thick finger toward the crippled LAV. "Pressure is a .50 caliber round cracking an inch from your skull. Pressure is knowing the lives of your men depend on you making a decision in the half-second it takes for an IED to decide if it likes you. What you feel right now, this heat, this is a vacation. This is a day spa compared to what's waiting for you out there." His sycophant, Corporal Davis, a man whose spine seemed to have been surgically replaced with a hinge, chuckled on cue. The young Marines, their faces slick with a mixture of sweat and apprehension, remained silent, their eyes fixed on the gunnery sergeant. They were clay, and he was the potter, molding them through sheer force of personality. He saw their fear and admiration and mistook it for genuine respect. His ego, a carefully constructed edifice of regulations, bravado, and bellowed commands, absorbed their attention like a dry sponge. It was the fuel he ran on. Without an audience, without the reflection of his own power in the eyes of his subordinates, he was just a man. And being just a man was Gunnery Sergeant Thorne's greatest fear. He needed the chorus to believe in the thunder because he secretly suspected there was no lightning behind it. It was then, in a sweeping survey of his domain, that his eyes snagged on the anomaly. In the far corner of the bay, away from the heat-blasted entrance and the cluster of acolytes, was a pocket of stillness. A figure sat on a low stool, hunched over a workbench cluttered with delicate instruments and microfiber cloths. It was an island of profound calm in his carefully orchestrated sea of restless energy. The figure was small, slight, and clad not in the rigid, reassuring geometry of a uniform, but in a plain, nondescript gray hoodie and worn cargo pants. The hood was up, casting the face in shadow. All Thorne could see was a pair of slender hands moving with an unnerving economical precision as they meticulously cleaned the multifaceted lens of a drone's optical sensor array. She was an affront, a violation of the natural order he had established. Her silence was not the respectful silence of his recruits. It was a different quality altogether. It was not empty, but full. It was a dense, quiet vacuum that seemed to suck the sound and fury out of his performance. His voice, which moments before had filled the entire bay, now felt thin and reedy, as if it were being absorbed by the quiet industry of that hooded figure. She did not look up. She did not acknowledge his presence. She simply continued her work, her focus an impenetrable shield. Thorne's mind, a blunt instrument designed for simple problems, processed this data through its only available filter. Stillness was weakness. Quiet was timidity. Lack of a uniform was a lack of discipline. Her focused work was not a sign of professionalism, but a mark of insolence. She was a nail that had failed to present itself for hammering. A civilian contractor, most likely. Some overpaid techie who thought the rules did not apply to her because she could wrangle a circuit board. He saw her not as a person, but as a challenge to his authority. A silent, passive-aggressive slight that could not go unanswered. The brittle shell of his ego demanded it. He would make an example of her. He would crack this little island of calm and show everyone, and most importantly himself, that his was the only gravity that mattered. A smirk curled his lip. The performance was about to get a new participant. "Well, well," he began, his voice dropping into a low, predatory drawl that carried across the bay. He started walking toward her, his boots suddenly loud in the expectant silence that had fallen. Corporal Davis scurried behind him like a pilot fish trailing a shark. "What do we have here?" He deliberately circled the workbench, forcing her to be the center of the semicircle formed by the now watching Marines. He wanted a stage. He wanted the maximum audience for the lesson he was about to dispense. He leaned over, planting his meaty hands on the bench, deliberately invading her personal space, his shadow falling over the delicate optics she was polishing. "Lost, little bird?" he asked, the condescension dripping from every syllable. "This is a workshop for warriors, not a library. You don't see a quiet sign anywhere, do you?" The figure did not flinch. The hands did not stop their slow, methodical polishing. After a moment, a voice emerged from under the hood. It was quiet, flat, and utterly devoid of emotion. It was the auditory equivalent of a perfectly smooth, gray surface. "I'm calibrating the MQ-9's gimbaled sensor package. The micro vibrations from the engine housing are throwing the laser designator off by 0.03 microns at 5 kilometers. It's enough to miss." The technical precision of her answer was a language Thorne did not fully understand, and it annoyed him. He wanted fear, or at least deference. He received only data. He straightened up, crossing his arms over his massive chest. "Is that so? Well, calibrating is a big word. You know what a bigger word is? Respect." He gestured vaguely at his own collar, where the gleaming chevrons of his rank sat. "When a gunnery sergeant is addressing you, you stop what you're doing. You look him in the eye. That's how it works in the real world, sweetheart. Or did they not teach you that at tech school?" Corporal Davis snickered, a high wheezing sound. The young Marines shifted uncomfortably. They could smell the cruelty, the exercise in pure dominance, and while they feared Thorne, a part of them recoiled from the sheer unfairness of the spectacle. The hooded figure finally paused. Her hands came to a rest on the workbench. Slowly, she lifted her head, and the shadows receded. The face they revealed was not what anyone expected. It was a woman's face, younger than her voice suggested, with sharp, intelligent features and eyes the color of a winter sky, pale, clear, and seemingly bottomless. A thin, silvery scar cut from her left temple to the edge of her jaw, a faint, pale line against her skin. It was the only mark of imperfection on a face that was otherwise a mask of placid neutrality. She looked at him, but it was not the look he expected. There was no fear, no anger, no pleading. Her gaze was like that of a camera lens. It observed, it recorded, but it did not judge. It simply took him in, and in its dispassionate clarity, Thorne felt a flicker of something he had not felt in years. He felt seen, not as a gunnery sergeant, not as a symbol of authority, but as an object of analysis. The feeling was profoundly unsettling. "My apologies, gunnery sergeant," she said, her voice still a perfect monotone. "The tolerances on this lens are microscopic. Dust particulates in this air can cause refraction errors. My focus was on the task." Her apology was so devoid of contrition that it felt like another form of defiance. It was a statement of fact, not an admission of wrongdoing. This infuriated Thorne even more. He was losing control of the narrative. He needed to reassert his dominance, to escalate until he got the reaction he craved. He reached out, his thick, calloused finger moving toward the gleaming, perfectly polished lens she had just spent hours on. It was a petty, cruel gesture, a threat to undo her meticulous work. "Tolerances," he scoffed, his finger hovering just above the delicate surface. "Let me tell you about tolerances. I tolerate competence. I tolerate discipline. I do not tolerate disrespect from some civilian grease monkey who thinks her job is more important than the chain of command." Before his finger could make contact, her hand moved. It was not fast. It was simply there. One moment her hand was on the bench, the next it was lightly but firmly enclosing his wrist. There was no aggression in the movement, no violence. It was as precise and economical as every other motion she had made, but the effect was electric. A current of pure shock passed through Thorne. It was not the strength of the grip. It was firm but not crushing. It was the absolute, unshakable certainty of it. It was like being stopped by a steel girder. Her touch was cold, final. "This is a $40 million piece of equipment, gunnery sergeant," she said, her voice dropping a fraction, gaining a hard, dense quality like packed ice. "Your fingerprints will degrade the anti-reflective coating. Please remove your hand." The public challenge was now undeniable. He had been touched. He had been commanded. The entire bay was silent, the only sound the faint hum of the ventilation fans. Thorne's face, already ruddy from the heat, darkened to a deep, dangerous crimson. The carefully constructed edifice of his ego began to crack. He snatched his hand back, not because she forced him, but because the shock of her touch had momentarily broken his resolve. "You put your hands on me," he snarled, his voice a low growl. He felt the eyes of the recruits on him, and his humiliation burned like acid. "You think you can get away with that? You think you're untouchable?" He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. You have no idea who you're messing with. He decided to destroy her, not physically, but professionally. He would expose her incompetence, prove that this quiet confidence was a sham. He straightened up, and his voice became a booming proclamation once more, for the benefit of his audience. All right, techie, you're so smart, you're so focused. See that bird over there? He pointed to the far side of the bay, where a sleek, menacing shape sat in its own cordoned-off area. It was the base's prize asset, an experimental stealth reconnaissance drone, the Spectre. She's been grounded for 3 days. My best avionics guys with a decade of experience, have been tearing their hair out trying to figure out what's wrong. The targeting system is shot. It's throwing a ghost error code that doesn't exist in any manual. The brass is breathing down my neck. You think you're so good? You fix it, right now, in front of everyone. He smiled, a cruel, triumphant expression. It was an impossible task, a checkmate. When she failed, he would have her thrown off the base so fast her head would spin. Her humiliation would be complete, and his authority would be cemented in legend. The silence in the base stretched, taut and expectant. The young Marine stared, caught between the unmovable object and the unstoppable force. The woman, Anya, simply looked from Thorn to the Spectre drone. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. All right, she said. Her preparation was a ritual of pure, unadulterated competence. She did not hurry. She did not show any sign of pressure or anxiety. Her movements remained a study in methodical grace. She retrieved a ruggedized datapad from a worn canvas bag at her feet, its screen scarred with the fine lines of hard use. She connected a single fiber optic cable to a port on the datapad, the click of the connector seating itself sounding like a gunshot in the silent bay. Thorn watched, his arms crossed, a smug certainty on his face. He expected her to run the same standard diagnostics his team had run a dozen times, to get the same nonsensical error code, and to finally admit defeat. This would be a slow, delicious burn. She walked to the drone, her footsteps making no sound on the dusty concrete. She did not plug the cable into the standard diagnostic port on the drone's fuselage. Instead, she knelt and opened a small, unmarked panel near the undercarriage, a panel Thorn's own team had overlooked, assuming it was for factory use only. She connected the other end of the cable. The entire process took less than 30 seconds. She stood holding the datapad, her eyes fixed on the screen. What happened next was not something any of them were equipped to understand. The screen of the datapad did not display the drone's user-friendly graphic interface. Instead, it exploded into a waterfall of pure, raw machine code, hexadecimal characters in assembly language, scrolling past at a speed that made it an unreadable blur of green on black. Her fingers began to move over the screen. Not typing, but swiping, pinching, and tapping in a complex arcane dance. She was not running a program, she was navigating the drone's central nervous system directly. She had bypassed the software, the operating system, the layers of abstraction, and was speaking to the machine in its native tongue. It was like watching a concert pianist perform a piece of impossible complexity. Thorn's smirk began to falter. This was not the work of a standard technician. This was something else entirely. The air crackled with a tension that was different now. It was no longer about a clash of personalities, but about the dawning, terrifying realization that they were witnessing a form of magic. The recruits leaned forward, their mouths slightly agape. Even Corporal Davis had stopped his sycophantic smirking, his face a mask of slack-jawed confusion. Ping. A single, soft, clear tone emitted from the datapad. It cut through the silence like a scalpel. The cascading code stopped. A single line was highlighted in red. Anya stared at it for a moment, then looked up, her gaze sweeping over the sleek composite skin of the drone. She walked along its length, her eyes tracing an invisible line. She stopped, her gaze fixed on a spot on the upper wing surface that looked identical to every other spot. She reached up and ran her fingertips over the area, a touch so light it was barely there. She turned back to Thorn. Her face held no triumph, no, I told you so. It was the face of a doctor delivering a diagnosis. The error isn't in the targeting software, she said, her voice the same quiet, flat monotone. It's a hardware flaw. There's a microscopic fracture in the insulation of the primary data conduit that feeds the targeting pod. It's located here. She pointed to the spot on the wing. It's less than the width of a human hair. Under normal atmospheric conditions, it's fine. But when the drone reaches an altitude of 30,000 feet, the drop in temperature and air pressure causes the composite material to contract just enough to break the connection. The system reads it as a software fault because the hardware itself reports a clean circuit during ground tests. You were looking in the wrong place. A profound, echoing silence descended upon the maintenance bay. It was a silence born not of fear or respect, but of sheer, brain-breaking shock. Thorne's entire worldview, his simple architecture of hammers and nails, had just been leveled by a nuclear detonation of quiet competence. He stared at her, then at the spot on the wing, then back at her. His mind was a frantic scramble of denial and disbelief. It was impossible. No one could find a flaw that small, that specific, that fast. His best team, with all their schematics and high-tech tools, had been stumped for 3 days. She had solved it in less than 3 minutes. That's impossible, he stammered, the words hollow and weak. His voice, once a rock slide, was now just a handful of pebbles. Anya simply held out the datapad. On the screen was a detailed schematic she had somehow pulled from the drone's core memory. A blinking red dot indicated the precise location of the fault. "It's not impossible," she stated, as if discussing the weather. "It's just improbable for a standard diagnostic suite to detect. The system was designed to look for what was broken, not for what was about to break." She then did the most devastating thing she could possibly have done. She showed no emotion. She did not gloat. She did not wait for an apology. She simply turned her back on him, walked back to her workbench, and resumed cleaning the optical lens as if the entire confrontation, the impossible feat of technical wizardry she had just performed, had been a minor and tedious interruption to her actual work. The dismissal was more complete, more annihilating to Thorne's ego than any shout or insult could ever have been. He was left standing in the middle of the bay, exposed, his authority stripped bare, his ignorance laid out for all his men to see. The hammer had just struck solid adamantium, and it had shattered. The spell was broken by the sound of a vehicle approaching at speed. A black up-armored SUV rolled to a stop at the entrance of the bay, its engine cutting off with a quiet hum that spoke of expensive high-end engineering. The dust settled. The rear door opened, and a figure emerged. The change in the atmosphere was instantaneous and absolute. If Thorne had been a planet, this new arrival was a black hole, a presence so dense with authority that it warped the very fabric of the room. He was a tall, lean man in a crisp, perfectly pressed uniform, the single star of a brigadier general gleaming on his collar. It was General Madsen, the commander of the entire forward operating base. Every Marine in the bay, including the shell-shocked Thorne, snapped to the most rigid position of attention they could manage. Bones popped, heels clicked, a collective, reflexive gasp of air was sucked in. Madsen's eyes, the color of chips of ice, swept the room. They took in the tableau, the terrified recruits, the stunned Corporal Davis, the utterly broken Gunnery Sergeant Thorne, and the small, quiet woman in the corner, still focused on her task, seemingly oblivious to his arrival. She had not stood. She had not saluted. She had not even looked up. Thorne, his training kicking in through the fog of his humiliation, opened his mouth to report, to try and salvage some shred of the situation. "General, sir, Gunnery Sergeant Thorne reports—" Madsen silenced him with a glance. It was not a glare or a look of anger. It was a look of pure, cold dismissal, as if Thorne were a piece of malfunctioning equipment. The general's gaze moved past him, past everyone, and settled on the figure at the workbench. He walked toward her, his polished boots making measured, deliberate sounds on the concrete. He stopped a few feet away from her, standing perfectly still. The silence was now a crushing weight, thick with unspoken meaning and dreadful anticipation. "We have a problem, Nix," General Madsen said, his voice low and imbued with a profound, weary respect. It was the voice of a man speaking to an equal, perhaps even a superior. The woman, Anya, finally looked up from her work. She pushed back her hood. She looked at the general, and for the first time, a flicker of something, not emotion but awareness, entered her eyes. She did not stand. She did not salute. She simply whispered a single word, a name that was not on any official roster. Viper. At the sound of that name, General Madsen, a man who commanded thousands of soldiers, a man before whom colonels trembled, did something that shattered the last remaining fragments of reality for everyone watching. He straightened his back, his posture becoming ramrod straight, his hand snapped up to his brow in a salute so sharp, so precise, it seemed to cut the air. He did not salute her as a general salutes a subordinate. He saluted her as a soldier salutes a legend. He held the salute, his arm rigid, his eyes locked on her face. Thorne's jaw hung open. His brain simply could not process the information his eyes were sending it. A general was saluting a civilian contractor. After a long moment, Anya gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. Only then did Madsen drop his salute. He then turned, his full attention finally falling upon Gunnery Sergeant Thorne. The coldness in his eyes had now been replaced by a quiet, controlled fury that was far more terrifying than Thorne's theatrical rage. "Gunnery Sergeant," Madsen began, his voice dangerously soft, "you are the senior non-commissioned officer in charge of this facility. It is your duty to maintain discipline, order, and the operational readiness of my assets. It is also your duty to know who is on your base and what their function is. Tell me, who do you think this is?" Thorne swallowed, his throat dry as dust. "Sir, I believe she was a civilian technical contractor, sir." Madsen's expression did not change. "You were wrong," he said, the words falling like chips of ice. "You are standing in the presence of Chief Warrant Officer 5 Anya Petrova. That rank, in and of itself, should have been enough for you to afford her every courtesy. But that rank is a lie. It's a cover. A piece of administrative fiction we use because her real designation doesn't officially exist." He took a step closer to Thorne, and the gunnery sergeant flinched as if from a physical blow. "This woman," Madsen continued, his voice resonating with a cold, hard history, "is the operator known as Nix. She is the team lead for a special missions unit, so far above your pay grade that you do not have the security clearance to even know its name. While you were learning how to shout at recruits, she was operating for months at a time, alone, behind enemy lines in places you have only seen on satellite maps. The Viper incident she just referenced? That was in Chechnya. She held off an entire armored platoon with a single rifle and a broken radio for 3 days, protecting a downed pilot. That pilot was me." A collective gasp went through the recruits. They were staring at a ghost, a myth made flesh. Madsen was not finished. He was systematically dismantling Thorne, piece by piece, in front of the very men he had tried to impress. "That scar on her face," the general said, gesturing with his chin, "was from shrapnel she took in Mogadishu while dragging 2 wounded Delta operators out of a kill zone. The mission was a catastrophic failure. The only reason it wasn't a complete massacre was because she single-handedly coordinated air support while holding a femoral artery closed with one hand and firing her sidearm with the other. She is here, gunnery sergeant, not as a technician, but as a field tester for advanced stealth systems. That drone you couldn't fix? She designed half the subsystems in its guidance package. She isn't here to fix our toys. She is here to determine if we are worthy of playing with them. And you, with your parade ground bluster and your pathetic need to bully anyone you perceive as weaker than you have just failed that test. Spectacularly." The general paused, letting the weight of his words settle and crush the last vestiges of Thorne's pride. "You did not just disrespect a fellow soldier. You disrespected a living legend. You endangered a critical national security asset. And you demonstrated a failure of judgment so profound that it calls into question your fitness to lead anyone, anywhere, ever again." He turned to Corporal Davis, whose face had gone a chalky white. "Corporal, pack your gunnery sergeant's things. He is relieved of command, effective immediately. He will be on the next transport back to a stateside desk job, where he will hopefully do no more damage. You will be joining him." Madsen's final look at Thorne was one of utter contempt. "Get out of my sight." Thorne stood for a moment, a hollowed-out man, the architecture of his ego reduced to rubble and dust. He tried to speak, to apologize, but no words came. He simply turned, his movements stiff and robotic, and walked away, his career and his identity utterly broken. The chorus of young Marines watched him go, their faces a mixture of awe, terror, and a dawning, profound understanding. Their entire conception of strength, of power, of respect, had been fundamentally and permanently rewritten in the span of 10 minutes. They were no longer looking at a small woman in a hoodie. They were looking at a giant. Anya, seemingly indifferent to the entire dramatic fallout, had already turned back to the young avionics tech who had been on Thorne's team, the one who had been struggling with the Spectre drone for days. She held out the datapad. "Replace that conduit board," she said, her voice once again a flat technical instrument. "Recalibrate the targeting laser to these specifications. The atmospheric distortion at altitude will be accounted for now." The young Marine, his hands trembling, took the datapad from her as if it were a holy relic. Anya gave him a brief nod, picked up her canvas bag, and walked quietly out of the maintenance bay, disappearing into the blinding white sunlight, leaving behind a legend and a lesson that would be told and retold for years to come. The story of Gunnery Sergeant Thorne and the quiet woman in the gray hoodie spread through the ranks like wildfire. It became a piece of institutional folklore, a cautionary tale whispered in barracks and training grounds from Kandahar to Paris Island. It was a story about the danger of assumptions, a stark reminder that the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield is not always the one that makes the most noise. The name Nix became a code, a shorthand for the concept of quiet, hidden competence, a boogeyman to frighten arrogant NCOs who mistook volume for value. Years later, at a dusty training range in the Mojave Desert, a new group of recruits were being taught a lesson on situational awareness. Their instructor was an older man, his once booming voice now quiet and measured, his eyes holding a haunted, permanent wisdom. It was Thorne. He was no longer a gunnery sergeant. He'd been allowed to finish his career as a sergeant, a quiet act of administrative mercy. He stood before the young, eager faces, and he told them a story. He told them about a hot day in a maintenance bay, about his own arrogance, and about the quietest person in the room being the most dangerous. He did not spare himself in the telling. His humiliation had become his greatest teaching tool. He had learned, through fire and shame, that true strength was not a performance, it was a state of being. And he dedicated the remainder of his career to ensuring that no young Marine under his charge would ever make the same mistake he did. He had been a hammer, and he had learned the hard way that some things were not nails, they were the anvil upon which hammers are broken. And Anya. She was never seen on that base again. She simply moved on, a ghost slipping from one shadow to the next. She might have been in a frozen landscape, calibrating a satellite uplink in the Arctic Circle, or in a humid jungle, testing new camouflage technology. Her work was the mission, not the recognition. The legend she had created was an unintended byproduct of her existence, a wake left by a ship that had long since passed over the horizon. She remained what she always was, the eye of the storm, a center of profound calm and devastating capability, utterly indifferent to the chaos that churned around her periphery. She was the professional, and the work was all that ever mattered. There is a fundamental misunderstanding in the human spirit about the nature of strength. We are drawn to the spectacle, to the loud and the boisterous. We mistake the roar of the waterfall for the power of the river. We see the peacock's display and assume it is the measure of its fitness, forgetting the silent, patient predator that watches from the grass. Arrogance is a hollow fortress, a set of imposing walls built around an empty keep. It is designed for external validation, its strength dependent entirely on the perception of others. It demands an audience, it requires applause. It feeds on the fear and deference of those it seeks to dominate. It is a brittle shell, easily shattered by the first encounter with something genuinely solid. True strength, real power, has no such requirements. It is a solid core of competence, a density of being that is entirely self-contained and self-aware. It has no need for performance because it is not a role being played. It is a fundamental state of existence. It is quiet because it has nothing to prove. It is still because it has no wasted motion. It does not seek validation from the outside world because its validation comes from within, from the successful completion of the task, the solving of the impossible problem, the survival against insurmountable odds. The world is filled with Gunnery Sergeant Thorns. They exist in every boardroom, every classroom, every corner of society where a little bit of authority is mistaken for a great deal of wisdom. They build their kingdoms on noise and intimidation, and they rule over those too timid to question the volume of their voice. But every now and then, a Nix walks into the room. They do not announce themselves. They seek no throne. They are there to do a job, to fix what is broken, to observe, to act. And their quiet